We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Modrovics. Joining me today is Mike from Parallel Systems YouTube channel. How are you today, Mike?
I'm very good, Tom. Thank you for inviting me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Mike, this is, I think, a really important topic that needs to be discussed. And I really want to, number one, point people towards your channel. It's excellent. You do a lot of great work, and I have really appreciated kind of getting to know you over our interactions. I think this is the third time we've had you on the show now. So go check out the Parallel Systems YouTube channel that Mike runs. Excellent stuff. And of course, today we're going to be talking about the book by David Rogers Webb that was brought to my attention, number one, by Dave, one of my listeners. And then, of course, you brought it to my attention as well. And it's called The Great Taking. And it's along the same lines of The Great Reset, yet I think it's a lot more sinister in a much more practical way for listeners of this show and your show as well. And really it's about how a protected class of elites could actually take the assets from the public, like stocks, bonds, and really anything that's finance, and talking about the actual mechanisms and legal structures that are now mostly in place, as from what I understand, to be able to facilitate taking a lot of these assets, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken to the author of the book. He is a genuine man. He ran a hedge fund. He ran multiple hedge funds. He really knows his stuff. He's a great guy. And anything that I say on the book, it's just my interpretation of it, Tom. I would say to every listener, please go and read the book for yourself. It's full of references, so you can go look at the primary documents. I've done as much as I can to do that, to go through the legal documents, to check out all the legal structures. And it's all sound. There's nothing there that I could find that is conjecture. It's very definite and very easy to follow the trail. So just before anyone says this couldn't happen, it's like, well, it is definitely in law and legislation. All of the mechanisms have been put in place over decades. So it does seem to me like this is the route of least resistance, actually. If you want to take people to the Great Reset, this is a pretty good way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the other things I want to say kind of at the outset here is hopefully we can do David's work, justice and have it a lot better known, because it deserves a lot of attention. Even if half of it turns out to work out this way, I think it's really important to understand. Of course, you've spoken with him. I have not, but I understand that he is a person that doesn't want attention, but wants people to understand this message. So hopefully we can do it justice and explain it to the best of our abilities, as we've both read it, dug into it, researched it quite a bit. I know you've put a lot of hours into this, and I really appreciate your time helping explain this as well.
So, yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. I appreciate it too. And just one last kind of caveat to that is, anything that I say on the book, please take it as my interpretation, not as David's literal words, because I will probably be adding my own comments and take on it. But yeah, pretty much we're going to go through the structure of it and lay it out, and then probably add our own parts to that. So, but if you want to read the original text, I would say definitely go. It's free. It's a free book. You can read it I read it in about 3 or 4 hours, Tom. I read it about 5 times now. So.
Yeah, I was going to say it's free for everybody to be able to read. There's a PDF of it that you can download. It's called The Great Taking, and it's available at thegreattaking.com. And again, it's written by David Rogers Webb, and it was just released in the last couple months here. So I encourage everybody to go check it out, because again, totally free. but really important stuff. So why don't we start, Mike, by explaining a little bit about who David is and kind of how he came to learn these pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, so in the first part of the book, in the prologue, David talks a little bit about himself personally. And David was somebody who was he was managing money, so he worked his way up. He feels, he says in the book, like he got a lucky break, and he got involved in some big funds, and he worked his ass off by all accounts, and he became very good at what he did. And he was eventually managing billions. He started his own fund and immediately had a number of very large donors looking for him to manage their money. And I mean, I read a few articles as well that I found online that showed that he was pulling in, double-digit returns and high returns during periods when people were losing substantial amounts, like the dot-com crash. And this was because of his understanding of the financial system, the velocity of money, and how that relates to to the workings of the financial system. And I think David started to pick up along the way. He figured something out around property rights was changing when it came to equities. And the more he dug down into it, it was like pulling on a thread. It started to unravel all kinds of other things, and he started to realize that when it came to our equities and bonds, that property rights were being subverted. And then I guess what he did was follow that over years and saw how the legislation was being changed. So not only was the property rights being subverted, some monster was being created out of the lack of property rights that we now had over our securities. So maybe we could start by actually defining the property rights part of it too, just to give listeners, just to really put a fine point on how important that part of the story is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the only other thing I would add there is, it seems to me, reading the book, reading through the prologue, that David was a person that learnt quickly, but he worked really hard to get to where he is. And I think a lot of us feel that way, that we've worked really hard to try to get to where we are, to try to get ahead, to try to insulate ourselves. And yet to have a mechanism in place that removes a lot of the property rights from your equities, from your bonds, from assets that you are counting on, is something that is of utmost importance to be able to protect or to understand the ability of somebody else to, in maybe the click of a mouse, to be able to take that away, right?
Yeah, it would be the greatest theft of wealth and transfer of wealth in human history by a long, long way. And I mean, David does mention that he started to first speak about this about a decade or so ago. He was putting on conferences for investors. I mean, he was somebody who was certainly a speaker that other people wanted to listen to. Mm-hmm. But he found that it was falling on deaf ears. People were not wanting to hear it because I don't think people had the perspective that we could now have, having lived through the last few years and heard about things like the Great Reset. Now all of a sudden, this kind of feels like they go together. Like the Great Reset and the Great Taking are one and two sides of a coin. One of them is the mechanism, and one of them is the ideology behind it. And he did say in his book that he was warned against speaking about it, and it took a lot of courage to speak about it and to make this book. But ultimately, it was something that he felt he had to do. He had to alert people to what could happen. And I think he makes it clear in the book he thinks it will happen.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Mike, let's go on to start by defining, let's say, the property rights piece and understanding, because to be fair, this is a fairly complicated topic. So we're going to try to break it down the best we can.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that everything that is listed in this book as to what's going to happen, we're not talking about some kind of cowboy scenario where people are stealing stuff from your house or coming with guns. No, this is a legal construct that's being created. Everything has been put through the law. So we first have to really understand what property rights are, because property rights themselves are a legal construct. And what they do is they give you controlling ownership over a resource or an asset. And that's defined in law. So it sets out what you can do with the asset. So you can pass it on to another party, transfer rights, you can derive economic benefit from it, sell it. You can even destroy it. You can if you own a building, you can demolish the building. If you own a forest, you can chop down the trees. So, that's property rights. It gives you the ultimate authority over the asset. So if there's a hierarchy, you're at the top of it when it comes to property rights.
And Mike,
that's what they tell you.
Yeah, you made a really good example of this and show the contrast in your example of people owning property in the UK, right? On your podcast that you did about it, you gave that example. So if you could give us that example again of how the Crown ultimately owns that land, and in a way, the people that are on it don't actually own it outright.
Yeah, it's this is something that I've spent a lot of years researching myself. So when I read David's book, it was like, for me, it was a bit of a, like, finally the missing piece for me was there. But when it comes to land rights in not just Great Britain, Tom, it's in a lot of the Crown colonies or ex-colonies too.
The Crown is the same, I believe, in some parts.
I think it's about 89% of the land in Canada is Crown controlled. And in the UK, it's actually written into our property laws that the Crown is the only absolute owner of land, which means that they have complete authority over the land, but you can have right to use it. So it's like a feudal system, and it is derived precisely from the feudal system, so that you can have a house on that land. But if you, for example, died, Tom, and you had no heir to pass on that land or house to, should I say, it immediately goes back to the Crown for them to dispose of, sell, because it's their land. So you have to really understand that the laws matter, and what we learn from the law is that things that have been there for thousands of years even can come back around today. So in the UK, like, for example, nobody owns that land, but the Crown. And, it's a subordinate. You are subordinate as an owner to the ultimate owner. And the same thing has happened now with securities. It's pretty much the same mechanism. Now, it's not the same in every country with land. Like, for example, in Scotland, when they became independent, legally speaking, they got rid of that structure. So now you can be an absolute owner of land. In the country I'm in, I can be an absolute owner of land. But there's still things like eminent domain as well. So that was a good example. And property can be two things. It can be tangible or intangible. You can have tangible property, which is like it can be a brick of gold, it can be a barrel of oil, a field of wheat, commercial real estate. That's tangible property. And then you've got intangible, which is something like, for example, a song or a pattern or text in a certain order. You can copyright it. And for something to be ascribed property rights, it has to be legally definable. So you have to be able to contrast it against something else. To assign property rights, it has to be something that you can really specify what it is. So you couldn't, for example, have property rights over, let's say you had a field of wheat. You can have property rights over the field and over the produce of that field, but you couldn't have property rights over the wind that blows across the field because it's too abstract. It can't be defined, and you can't isolate it from a much bigger whole because your neighbor's field is going to have the same wind blowing across. So, it's too abstract for it to work in that scenario. Mm-hmm. And that's important to understand because it actually comes back around later on. So pretty much, Tom, the property rights give you as the owner the ability to do pretty much what you want with it. Of course, there's always limitations, but it gives you the ability to do that over the to the exclusion of other interests or other supposed, let's say, it could be the state, even the state could be subordinate in terms of what they can do. Like, they can't just step in. When America was created, they fully understood that property rights were the bedrock of freedom. And what they saw over in the UK is you had an entire class of people that were propertyless and they weren't allowed to own property. And that made them a slave. It made them a serf. So that was enshrined in the Constitution. And they were very careful to ensure that the US citizens could have property rights. Because if all of our property rights are taken away from us and our property is taken, then we essentially become slaves. And again, this is a theme that we need to come back to later on, because in the Great Taking, essentially, what's going to happen if it is enacted is all of the property will be taken, and it will take us back to a form of serfdom. So I just think it's important to understand that trajectory, that property rights are the bedrock of freedom. Now, when it comes to dematerialization, this is really important to understand too, because when it comes to things like securities, stocks, bonds. It was the case for hundreds and hundreds of years that you, as the purchaser of those assets, would have property rights over them. And it was a very direct and literal property right, because if you bought, for example, some stocks from a company, you would be sent the certificates. So you'd actually have a physical representation of the stock, and it would be assigned to you. You'd actually have piles of these certificates, and people used to put them in safes, Tom, because if you stole the certificate, you actually had the property. You actually, it's like me stealing a lump of gold from you. I'd have the property itself. It was a tangible asset, and this was enshrined in the Uniform Commercial Code in the US, which was published in 1952 and was subsequently adopted by all states. And it laid out in there that in Article 8, securities were actually based on the possession and delivery of a certificated bearer security. So that certificate was actually the possession. That's how you became the property owner, was by getting the certificate. And to transfer it, you had to transfer the physical document. So again, it was something tangible, and legally that's important because it made it very easy to ascribe property rights to a person over their equities or bonds, because they would have something physical to show for it.
Yeah, and I think that's where really the rubber meets the road here, Mike, is that this ends up affecting the shares that you own in companies. Again, this comes back to, if you hold shares in XYZ company, whether it's a gold miner, whether it's a tech company, whatever it is, even if, as Bill Holter has mentioned on the show a couple times, and I'm sure a couple of other guests have as well, the idea to even get physical delivery of your share certificates doesn't necessarily protect you in this case, because of the legal structures that are now in place to protect the ultimate creditors, if I understand that correctly.
That's correct. And just before we get to that part, I just wanted to kind of just add to the timeline. And also, actually, we should have mentioned as well, bonds were the same. People today still talk about bonds having a coupon. Bonds literally were a piece of paper with coupons attached. And each year, there'd be one for each year of the duration of the bond. You'd detach it, you'd go into the bank, hand over the coupon, and they'd give you your interest. And you'd do that the entire way through. And at the end, you'd take the leftover certificate with no coupons left to get your principal back. Mm-hmm. So, I just wanted to paint that in the viewer's mind that these were physical assets before. And then in the 1970s, there was something that they called the paperwork crunch. And they decided that because of this paperwork crunch, because you can imagine that as this system increased in volume, this global financial system started to emerge, they were shipping around all of these paper assets and storing them in filing cabinets. Now, whether the paper crunch is real or not, because I know that David says in the book there was no evidence to show that it was real, it did start to lead to the creation of these structures that you're talking about now, Tom, these structures that were more digitized. Of course, digital didn't come from much later, but what they did start to do was to create a book entry system. So rather than now me mail, if I was the company and you brought me the cash, I would mail out you the shares or give them to you. Now it started to add layers of intermediaries to the system. And rather than give you something physical, you would get something intangible, which would be your name in a book entry system. So it'd be, for example, let's imagine, Tom, that we're using the same broker and you buy 100 shares of a company. Let's imagine a company called Supergold. You're going to buy 100 shares of it and you go to the company. Now it's in the book entry. So Tom's got 100 shares. But let's imagine you gave me the tip. You said, Mike, I've got this fantastic company. I recommend it. So I was like, I'm going to buy 100 shares. And we use the same broker. So now what happens is they ascribe 100 shares to me. Now, I'm going to simplify it a lot because the system's actually far bigger than this, and we'll get to that later. But in this book entry format, what they would essentially do is pull those assets. So now the company, the broker, has 200 shares, 100 of mine, 100 in yours, but they're not separate. They're not actually separated in the book entry system. They just have 200 shares. So rather than us actually have a physical representation of those shares, that's ours, which has maybe a number on it like it used to be. What we now actually have is a pool of shares with my shares, your shares, and anyone else who has bought that company, which we made up, Supergold. And all clients' assets are now in a big pool. And thus, what you actually have is not ownership over an asset, but a prorated claim to some of the pooled assets. Now, that was key because that is how property rights started to be eroded. Once they started to go to this book entry system, it opened the door such. Now, it didn't necessarily mean that property rights were going to be completely usurped. There was plenty of other things that could have happened. But what actually happened was they used that as the mechanism to start usurping property rights.
Yeah. So in a way, this has been a step-by-step process that has taken years to implement, to come up with, and to, let's say, make or form precedent for these structures to be able to exist, right?
Yeah, because once this started to happen, what they did in the US was they created a literally a single central entity called the Depository Trust Corporation. And the DTC, as we'll call it, just for ease, is the largest securities depository in the world now. So it has all of the securities issued by the US are held with that. So you have to understand now, whereas before you'd go to the company and it would be you engaging directly with the security issuer, now you're engaging with an intermediary who's engaging with an intermediary all the way up a hierarchy until you get to the DTC, and they hold all of the issued securities in one massive pool. So essentially what's happened is these securities, the bonds, the stocks, they've become what we now call intangible fungibles, because it's an intangible thing and it's fungible in that any share on the book, so let's imagine one share of Supergold. We might have to start this company, Tom, now. We need to start Supergold, but this one share of the company, that one share on the company, on the balance sheet, the book entry, it would be identical to another share. So the fungible. So therefore, there is no distinction. The contrast has been lost. And going back to my example at the start, if you imagine a wind blowing across a field, you can't have property rights over the wind because it's not definable. You can't separate it and create a contrast between one field and another. Well, it's just the same with securities now. They are literally all held by the DTC in America and 121 other countries too. So they've got around 35 trillion there. And as a clearing agency registered with the SEC, they provide security custody and book entry transfer services for all of the securities transactions in the US market involving equities, bonds, debt, the whole lot. So it's literally is all held in one system in the US, and there's a few more of them. There's one in Europe as well called Euroclear. But let's just shelve that for a moment, because I just wanted to reiterate what that's done for property rights, because it had profound implications. Because what they call these what they call the securities now is fungible bulk, which means, like I said, they're all held in one. It's just one big bulk. So it's almost seen as one giant asset. Mm-hmm. So going back to my statement about the wind, you can see it's very hard now to ascribe Tom property rights or Mike property rights, because if you try to do this legally, there's not any clear definition in that bulk of who's got what. So what you now actually have is just a pro rata claim. And this is laid out in the book as a security entitlement. So you've gone from having full property rights now to having security entitlement, and you are placed at the bottom of a very big hierarchy. And I'm sure we'll get to how that's been exploited as well as we go through this.
Yeah, I think that's in a way the craziest part to me, is that really you're placed at the bottom of a hierarchy when you think you do and you feel that you own, let's say, shares in this company, yet you're ultimately the last creditor that ends up being paid out in a crash scenario.
Yeah, well, David,
Tom. That can absolutely be precipitated by these trillions upon trillions of dollars worth of derivatives that are really piled on top of a much, much smaller foundation of the financial system, right?
Yeah, it's very much the same as with bank deposits. You know, if you go to the bank, Tom, and you try and, if you look at your balance, you'll see some numbers. If you try to draw out some cash, it will work. And you look at your phone or your app and you think, okay, that's my money, but it's not, because all of those securities, all of those notes in the bank, they're not assigned to you. You know, it's just a $10 note is a $10 note. If it comes out the machine, you've got it, but it's not specifically yours. Well, securities have been turned into something quite similar. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like a currency. It's all held centrally. And that's open for exploitation in just the same way that our bank deposits have been leveraged now for bank bail-ins. It's very much the same with securities. They've created a bail-in mechanism for the system, for the derivatives complex, for some secured creditors. So, we've got this kind of fantasy that if, a lot of people still have it with banking, that the money's there, it's in a vault somewhere, they're taking care of it, and it's safe. But of course, we know it's not true. If you go back to what happened in Greece or what happened in Cyprus, where they got bailed in, or 2008 Northern Rock in the UK, people went to the cash machines, nothing came out, and what was happening behind the scenes was they were deciding who's going to get to take those deposits. It wasn't, and you was at the bottom of the hierarchy once more. Now, since that time, they've put in the bail-in legislation everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's just the same way, like I said, with the system of securities, and we are now unsecured creditors unto the system. And this is where it gets extremely disturbing, Tom, because having eroded our rights through the mechanisms that we've already mentioned, and there was a legal part to that too. You have to understand that all throughout this, let's say, 2 or 3 decade long process, they were constantly trying to harmonize it so that everyone was on the same legal structure, and that laws and any national laws would be worked around or simply removed to allow this to be a seamless and effortless thing once the great taking was employed, if it does get employed. Mm-hmm. So they have, in a very literal sense now, legally set up for all of your assets, everybody's that's contained within this system, to now be eligible to be used as somebody else's collateral. So that makes you the unsecured creditor at the bottom of the hierarchy in this crash scenario. But just to back up for a second, collateral is first and foremost, it's used to manage credit risk. And the credit risk, of course, would, in a market's crash or some kind of GFC type moment, that's huge. The default risk goes up. So then everyone has to start putting up collateral. Well, that's that's your securities now that are going to be used as a collateral. So anything that's held in custodial accounts, pension plans, investment funds, mortgage property, factories, plant equipment, farms with debt outstanding, the whole lot, everything that people think they own and that is tied to the system has been legally added to the collateral pool that will be taken by a group of secured creditors and it's going to be used to underpin the derivatives complex. Now, as we know, Tom, the derivatives complex has quadrillions in there. The Bank of International Settlements just admitted that there's at least 1 quadrillion in there. Now, I've been saying on my show for a long time, 2 to 4 quadrillion, because so much of it is off balance sheet. Nobody knows where it is. It's in the shadows. But this is essentially like petrol stored in the basement, and they just keep adding to it. At some point, the spark's going to hit that, and it's just going to go up. So there's actually no way to backstop that system. Like, it's impossible to backstop the derivatives complex. But what the book makes clear is that's the point. The point is not to backstop it so all the collateral can be taken. Like, if you imagine, like, all the assets are on a big table, they're just going to sweep it all off into the lap of a secured creditor class. And legally, this has already been tested. So that's kind of the dark part of the book, that this is all set up to happen. But I'll hand it back over to you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make two points, kind of to make sure that we kind of on the same page here, and again to acknowledge David a little bit as we go through the book, because a lot of this does sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, and I can see where people would absolutely think that, even if, let's say, this ends up only being half true, just play devil's advocate, that creates a really scary scenario in my mind. But again, David acknowledges that there are a lot of people that have called him a conspiracy theorist, or looked at these views and seen it in that way. But I think that going through this book, understanding this stuff, vetting the sources as you and I have, it really makes a lot of sense on how these mechanisms can actually work. That was number one. If you want to add something there, Mike.
Yeah, I just say there's actually zero ambiguity about it in law. They actually pursued something which is called what's the term that's used for it? I think it's
was it safe
I think
harbors?
it might Not the safe harbors part, but that's
Okay.
important to mention too. But they produced something called I think it was perfection in law, and perfection in law is where you have something that is iron tight, like there's no ambiguity at all. And therefore, once it gets to the stage where this is going to be deployed, there's going to be no barriers. It's like the foundations of Tuckoutsett will just be so effortless. If they're bringing down a building, a controlled collapse, you have to take out all of the structure, all of the foundations, and all of the beams, and then it comes down. Well, it's just the same as that. And it was done step by step. So there were certain countries, for example, like Sweden. Sweden, when they went to the digitized system, they actually wrote into their law that they would retain, the owners could retain ownership rights in much the same way they had when they had the paper contracts. And they did this by actually having people's assets put into a segregated account. So the dematerialization didn't force the loss of property rights there. And if you bought bonds and shares in Sweden, it would be in a segregated account, and they had this system called the VPC system. And the registration conferred pretty much the same legal effect of possession of the bearer document, just as in the same system. So you maintain direct ownership, and it couldn't be taken as collateral for someone else. Well, they went through every country, so they did the whole of Europe, and they literally tried to enact this globally. So there was zero resistance. And it's called in the book Harmonization, which is where the legislation around property rights in relation to securities was effectively made consistent across all countries. So any pockets of resistance or pre-existing legal doctrines, because some of them are centuries old, like there's one Lex Re Citae, I think it's called. That's a very old doctrine that means the rights for the property rights are determined by the location of that property. So they had to do away with that. So they've really had to work at this, Tom. It's not something that could be haphazardly come across where someone could make the conclusion that, oh, they're going to take this, or whether the conclusion could be they're going to maybe do it. No, it's like, no, actually, it really required a really concerted effort. And I'd say it's actually unequivocal that the mechanisms are there, the goal was there, the idea was driving this, and whether they actually do it or not, I can't say. That's just conjecture.
The only other point I wanted to make, Mike, is the idea that, in a way, there is precedent for this, right? There is precedent for bank holidays. And I wanted to read a piece from the book. And really, it makes me think about the hubris of central bankers and how the Fed was acting up unto the bank holiday in the Great Depression. I'll quote from the book now. It says, in the Wikipedia article, The Great Depression, we find the following illumination of the Fed's odd behavior in the years leading up to the bank holiday. And again, I mention this because it seems, very, very pertinent with the times now. So the monetarist explanation was given by American economist Milton Friedman and Anna J. Schwartz. They argued that the Great Depression was caused by the banking crisis that caused 1/3 of all banks to vanish, a reduction of bank shareholder wealth, and more importantly, monetary contraction of 35%, which they called the Great Contraction. By not lowering interest rates and by not injecting liquidity into the banking system to prevent it from crumbling, the Federal Reserve passively watched the transformation of a normal recession into the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve allowed some large public bank figures, particularly that of the New York Bank of the United States in December 1930, which produced panic and widespread runs on local banks, and the Federal Reserve sat idly by while banks collapsed. Friedman and Schwartz argued that if the Fed had provided emergency lending to these key banks, or simply bought government bonds on the open market to provide liquidity and increase the quantity of money after the key banks fell, all the rest of the banks would not have fallen after the large ones did, and the money supply would not have fallen as far as it did. This view was endorsed in 2002 by Federal Reserve Governor Ben Bernanke in a speech honoring Friedman, and Schwartz with the statement, "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say Milton and Anna are right. Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." That just is the craziest quote to me, to consider that something that I think that people forget that the Federal Reserve is a private institution that serves a certain select, number of people and not necessarily the interest of everyone, right?
I think this is what it comes down to. It's understanding the arc of history, and that these are not public institutions. They're not there for the benefit of the good or for the many. They're there for the benefit of a select few. Mm-hmm. And they've created such a hyper-financialized system. It's so warped and distorted. I mean, 2 to 4 quadrillion in derivatives. There's no way to fix that. There's no way to fix the global debt problem. Now, a lot of people frame this as these nations have to fix their debt problem. And these nations are going to come together using their central banks, but they're missing the point. It's not their central banks. They're beholden to central banks. And if you want to understand why all of our politicians are beholden to financial interest and corrupt, that's why. It's because they're not serving us as the people. They're serving their financial backers. There was an example of all of these rules actually coming, all of these legislations that we're talking about being used. If you go back to 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, JP Morgan, they actually took clients' assets and they used them as collateral at that point when the credit risk, they actually took those assets and used them without telling the client, because the laws were already in place. Now, some of those clients actually came back and said, whoa, wait a minute, that was our assets and you put them up as collateral, and they took them to court. Mm-hmm. And what do you think the court said, Tom?
They're the ultimate creditor.
They said there's nothing you can do about it. They said they're more important than you. They're securities, they're not yours. In this instance, the collateral is theirs to take because they're a systemically important financial institution. They meet the criteria legally that's defined as a secured creditor. So you don't have a leg to stand on. Now, of course, since then, they've expanded it to the entire system. But that just shows you the legal precedent is already there. And going back to what you said, there is a the historical precedent, should I say, that if you want to consolidate power, if you want to consolidate wealth, you just do the rug pull. They back then in the Great Depression, they decided not to bail out the system. Now, some people look back and say, well, that was a mistake. We got it wrong. And it's like, really? Or maybe some people got rich. Maybe some people bought up all the assets, for pennies on the dollar. Maybe that's the goal, is the more assets you take, the more power you then have. And if you've been watching what's been happening the past few years and you think, it seems to me like they want to take us to a complete authoritarian system where we do own nothing and they own everything, well, then you can start to put 2 and 2 together on this one and say, well, there's the mechanism. And once you go through the book and you realize the tremendous amount of effort and planning that would have been involved to get to this stage, what we're talking about now, well, where it ensures absolute priority is legally enshrined for a group of secured creditors, that they can access that pool of securities and take them as collateral. And there's legal certainty around that, and it's been pursued for decades and decades. Well, then it's actually quite chilling, isn't it, Tom?
It really is. And that's I think one of the craziest points of the book, in a way, after the first time I had read it and kind of sat down to digest it, is that really this has been an ongoing process for many years. And it's possible, reading through the timeline in the book of how long it has taken them to put this structure in place, makes you really understand that if you try to ascribe a motive to figuring out why they would go through all of that painstaking work, really, there's no other reason that you can, or conclusion that you can come to, other than to protect and ultimately deliver all of this collateral to those creditors who are ultimately deemed the systematically important ones, and not you and I.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Tom. I mean, you're an athlete, Tom, and I was a competitive athlete. And what do you do in the build-up to a big event, which in our case is a race or a competition? Mm-hmm. You do lots of preparation, and you try to make sure no stone's left unturned. You want certainty that you're going to go into that competition or that event as prepared as possible. So, you do all of your training, you get a lot of rest, you do stretching, rehab, you work on your mental state. So you're thinking about sports psychology, visualization, getting yourself prepared to win. you work on your diet. You don't leave any stone unturned, and it really does feel to me like when we look at what's being done, that's the thing. And what you don't do is you don't do all of that preparation, and then a few days out from the event say, I'm gonna no, I'm not going to bother. That's not what you do. You go, you do it because you plan to actually go forward with that. You don't put all the time and effort in unless you're going to go forward with the event. So yeah, I mean, you have to assume that the risk of this happening is high. That's all I can take away from it, is that you have to assume it's high. I mean, and one thing we didn't mention was the central clearing party and how that was deliberately underfunded to ensure that this whole thing could actually take place. So I don't know if you wanted to discuss that, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one piece maybe before we get to that, just to, again, kind of crystallize this for people to be able to understand the tangibility of it and the possibility of it, is, again, going back to the idea of taking your shares out as share certificates and having them delivered to you in your own name. If this goes through and, most people don't take steps to protect themselves or whatever it is, you and I were talking about this a little bit before we hit record here this morning, about the idea that taking these shares out, theoretically, they still are in the system and being held by the clearinghouse. Yet, even if you thought that this gave you a piece of protection, I would say, by holding the physical certificate, if most people don't do that, and there is, or when there is a big crash, then there's not going to be any liquidity to be able to trade any of these shares with afterwards. So really, it makes the point moot on both sides, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't think people understand that if you were given some physical representation of your shares now, it doesn't matter because the whole system is not geared around those physical shares, and you don't actually have the property rights through those shares like you used to. Your shares are still held as intangible fungibles as part of one giant pool that can be accessed at any point, because they've created in each country central security depositories and then international ones. And at any point, they can look at where any asset is. So there is no such thing as taking it out. It might make you feel better that you've got a certificate now, but it's not the same as before. And you mentioned it already, Tom. They've even changed safe harbor bankruptcy laws. They've removed the ability for segregated account holders to be exempt. So even if you've got let's say you've got a sophisticated financial instrument that segregates you, they've circumnavigated that in the laws too. They've made it impossible for revindication to happen. So that's taking back your own securities in the event of an insolvency. It's like every escape hatch has been welded shut. It's very, very precise. So yeah, that wouldn't work, Tom. Even having the certificates, it really is like ironclad as far as, I mean, I've read books. I read a whole book on law relating to this that was done before David's book. It was about a decade before. And the book was all about the legal structures. So this is not something that other people haven't picked up on. It's just that nobody in our communities has put two and two together to realize what could be done to us with this giant rug pull.
Yeah, it's fortunately, I wish we had kind of a cheerier topic to talk about here today, Mike. But again, this is, to me, is one of those books that really makes you stop and scratch your head and think about what our future ends up looking like. And if this comes to pass, what happens to the people that were counting on these securities that they feel that they hold, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've always believed that let's just start with it really simply. I mean, when I first come on your show, Tom, I don't know if you remember, one of the very first things that I said to you was that every monetary system at some point ends and the reserve currencies always change. So it's not like this is anything new. We all should have been expecting that at some point, this experiment of completely fiat money that started in 1971 would come to an end. Now, the other thing that we know is you cannot tighten a Ponzi scheme because it requires fresh notes to continuously be printed and added to the system. Mm-hmm. So we're in that stage now where there's zero growth, and all they can do is devalue what already exists. So you can double the digits on a screen, just double it and devalue everything. Mm-hmm. But there are all these debt instruments in the system, those 2 to 4 quadrillion, and there's no answer to that. So if we know that there's no answer to the derivatives time bomb, and we also know that there is no way to tighten a Ponzi scheme, and we also know that all monetary systems come to an end, well, therefore, it takes you to this endgame scenario no matter which way you look at it. And of course, if you're somebody who is power mad, your goal would be to leverage that to make sure that you come out of the whole thing on top, that you're going to be even more powerful in the next system. And I guess, I guess that's what the setup is there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about from a couple different ways, I think, right? Is the idea that once you have accumulated enough wealth, the only thing you crave or have want for after that is power. I think that's well established. But David also makes an interesting point in the book about monetary velocity. It has been going the same way interest rates have for decades. Just continues to fall. He was very aware of how let's say the injection of fresh quantitative easing and its effect on the stock market, and he had personal experience with seeing how that worked its way through the system. But another thing that I think that another piece in the book that is really interesting is talking about this everything bubble collapse, which we've been talking about for quite some time. Obviously, we're at a point now in history where that everything bubble has been built. It is, let's say, teetering precariously, where whether you believe that or not, I don't know that we can, with these debt levels, continue to deny that. But the idea that he brings up the book is talking about the ability to recover economically after a Great Depression. In the 30s, we had a lot of drivers to consider that helped end that period of the Great Depression, that helped build back the economy after that. So consider in the period from the 1920s into the 1950s, more than 3 decades, there was little recovery in price level of homes, of assets, of all kinds of things. I think of the absolutely massive demand drivers present through those decades: electrification and all that it enabled, like refrigeration, appliances of all kinds, industrial machinery, the automobile and the associated build out of the highway system and suburbanization, telecommunications, so telephone, radio, and television, air travel, a global war followed by the Korean War and the Cold War arms race, population growth. And none of these drivers of demand are present now, right? We're facing stagnation at very least in a lot of those same categories. So to think that we have the ability to come back after the popping of the everything bubble because of demand is unfortunately misguided as well.
Yes, and I think they understand this very clearly. Like they truly do know. And I don't think, okay, there's a lot of power involved in what they're doing, and clearly there is a lot of power, but they are trying to do it legally. That's one thing to remember. Like these are legal constructs. And the other thing that I would say is it also is desperation. They're extremely desperate because they know as well as we do that this system is coming to an end. They're terrified of the power vacuum that will ensue when the main mechanism of control, which is debt, all that system crashes. And now all of a sudden, then what do you have? You have a lot of angry people, and they're going to want to know, why is everything being taken from me? Mm-hmm. And let's face it, Tom, like if you wanted to, there would be a way to reset the system globally where everyone could just say, okay, we're going to come together and reset the debt, or, some kind of jubilee. Like, it's not like there aren't other potential scenarios, but that would require people to redistribute their wealth. I'm talking about people at the very top, and that's not what they're looking to do. And I was speaking to a professor recently on my podcast called Fabio Vihi, and he said that all they can do now, or their main objective now, is to manage poverty. It's not to increase wealth; it's to manage poverty. And I think that is accurate. That's what the next system is going to be. UBI. If they achieve it, it would be UBI. Nobody with any ownership, control over what you say, what you think, what you eat, control of your access to resources, and it's managing poverty. It's just making sure you've got the subsistence, and probably adding loads of technology to that system to control you, so they can do it from a very hands-off perspective. But in terms of actually creating wealth, like you said, I don't see any mechanism for great wealth creation. It's going to be extremely deflationary anyways, with AI and automation and robots and all of those things. But once you add to that this whole reset of the current system, particularly if they do the great taking, but even if they didn't, Tom, it would still be hugely deflationary. And David mentions in the book how his grandfather bought three properties. He bought three properties in the 1920s in Cleveland during the boom phase. And those three properties were not sold until I think it was 32 years later. So it was after the Great Depression, and they sold for a third of the value that he paid for them. So that's the great deflation. That's what we're talking about. And he also mentions a family business that sold for a fraction of what it was worth 100 years back almost. That's deflationary. So even all the assets that do survive this, there's going to be a great deflation in value. And the only thing that I can see in this event that will go up substantially, I'm talking like to insane levels, would be physical gold with no counterparty risk, for the simple reason it's the only thing that's unadulterated and outside of the system. It cannot be scooped back up because it's kept outside of it. I mean, you could argue other things like property and land, but of course there are still counterparties there. So the zero counterparty asset that has always preserved and protected wealth, that's everything else is going to devalue against that and deflate against that. Whereas the demand for the physical of that, particularly as people start to realize what's happening, would go up to something crazy. Now, of course, whether they try a confiscation or something like that, that's a different matter. But I'm just talking about if we're looking at it objectively, then it's the physical bullion that will suddenly become the most powerful asset in the world. And we're seeing central bank buying at record levels. It kind of makes sense that they would be privy to some of this. They would understand what's coming. And those people at the central banks, the nations themselves, they are not going to be trusting one another, because it always comes back to that one word, doesn't it? Trust. As this thing unravels, zero trust. Nobody's going to trust anyone. So you're going to have to put up something of real physical, tangible assets. We're going from the intangibles back to the tangibles. I think that's what I took away from it too.
So, Mike, what place do you think silver has in this as well? Like, it's not only gold, is it?
No, I actually hold silver in a very high priced place, but for different reasons. I think gold is the wealth preserver, and it's the asset of last resort. I don't think we're going to see nations moving silver around to pay one another or as collateral for any future credit that they take. Because if we go to a new system, it will have credit once more. I'm sure of it. Credit is how you control nations even. So I think that's where gold is. And as an individual, that is like your bedrock. If you listen to something like this and think, I better preserve some wealth. I've always been about wealth preservation and risk management. It doesn't mean I don't speculate at times, but I think everyone should have a bedrock of wealth preservation, and that's the physical gold. But in this scenario that we're talking about, the silver would be absolutely critical, not for speculation, but for actual payments. I'm a farmer, Tom, and if somebody came to me and offered me some fiat notes in this crisis, what would I do? Would I keep my eggs, or would I take the fiat notes? Of course, you'd keep the eggs. They're far, far more valuable to me in that scenario. The price of them eggs are going up, Tom. I might triple them, I might quadruple them. But and that's where silver would come in. It would give you actually something that's that you can use as a payment system, and it's of a smaller value. It'd still be extremely valuable, but you'd be able to use it between different people, particularly if you start to create a parallel system. Now, again, I'm sure a lot of people, or some people listening to this, might say this sounds outrageous. This sounds absolutely crazy. Well, just take yourself back to the Great Depression. Or in fact, let's go a little bit closer. I live in Poland. My wife grew up during totalitarianism over here in communism, Soviet Poland. In Soviet Poland, gold was outlawed. But if you wanted to trade with people, people were trading in old silver coins, from the monetary system of Poland from the 1930s and 40s. And people were trading everything, Tom. It wasn't just silver coins. My father-in-law would travel across to Germany. He'd smuggle back motorcycle helmets because there wasn't any in Poland. And then they'd exchange and trade. So this idea of going back to a trade and barter system, it's not as crazy as people think. It's happened very recently, and I think it will happen again. So for me, that's where silver comes in. That is a perfect form of money for trade and barter and for moving things around. Whereas gold, yeah, it's going to be too valuable. And gold might be that life raft from one system to the next, because ultimately, I think no matter what happens, this whole thing falls apart. I just don't think there's any way you pull this off. You can try, and you can, in the first tranche of that collapse, you could take all the collateral that's digitized. It's there. It's going to happen. It's a flick of a button. It's a press of a button on a keyboard, Tom. So I don't see any way of avoiding that besides de-risking yourself in some way. But outside of that, I think it then collapses. I don't think they achieve some new system where everyone's just going to go along with it. So I think we go back to something very simple. And of course, a lot of us out there are actually starting to create the foundations of those new systems now. I mean, I live here on a farm in a very rural location. I mean, there's only so much you can do, and you don't want to go too crazy with it. But I think it's very prudent now to actually, what's the line in your intro, Tom, for the Palisades Gold Radio? This is the time you have to really start paying attention. I would reiterate that. Now's the time to really start paying attention, because things are going to change very fast. And we've both agreed, or I think you agree with me, you can't tighten a Ponzi scheme, and they are tightening a Ponzi scheme. Now, whether that's a rug pull that comes next and all of this takes place, or they kick the can down the road a little bit longer, so they've got more time to get the next system in place, I don't know. But I'm certainly paying attention myself and trying to figure out how I'm going to best protect myself and my family in this. And I think community is a big part of that too. We really need to start reaching out to one another and building those communities, because we're going to need them if this does unfold. And if it doesn't, then good. I'll be very happy if this never happens.
I couldn't have said that better myself, but if we're building these communities and we have these connections, that only makes us stronger, together anyway. Sharing this information is extremely important. But Mike, I want to talk to you a little bit about what you think that, obviously there's no way to know the timing of this, but there are certain, pieces of this legal framework and these structures that have been, even recently, up until this year, have been finalized and put into place, right?
Yeah, David mentions that there was a few final pieces of legislation that just removed some smaller elements to it, and I can't remember the specific ones, so you'll have to go to the book to find that out. But he ultimately arrives at the conclusion that everything's set up now. So, the wires are in place, the plunger's there, it's just going to require something. And yeah, they are tightening. And, I don't know. I mean, I think if something like this was going to come through, it would be similar to what they had to do after the repo spike in 2019. They needed something big narratives. Big narratives are very good for allowing people to do big things, whether that's print a ton of money, which could be what we see first, Tom. They could print a ton more money and kick this one down the road. But ultimately, we are going to arrive back at the same place. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when this would happen. So, they've been talking a lot recently over the past 2 years, since 2019. Of course, we had the COVID thing, but before that, even they were talking also about cyber pandemics. And I know they've put a lot of preparation and wargaming into that. That's something that they've been ramping up a lot substantially. And there was one in 2021 called Collective Strength. So that was led by Israel, but it had UK, United States, United Arab Emirates, Germany, Italy, Thailand. The IMF were there, the World Bank, the BIS, everyone who's anyone was at that war game. And what they did there was they simulated an attack on the global financial system. So it's specific to the financial system. And that kind of pricked my ears up, because some of the solutions that they came up for that would be exactly the kind of solutions you might need to try and control this, the collapse of this system. So one of them was a coordinated bank holiday, which again, if you go back to the Great Taking, it was a bank holiday that was used. Debt repayment grace period, swap repo agreements, and a coordinated delinking from major currencies. So, I mean, these are big moves, Tom, and all of the key players were there discussing it. So I think a cyber pandemic, whether it was real or initiated by someone else, I'll leave that to the listener to decide. But that would be a fantastic smokescreen for some of these mechanisms to start being done without. I mean, it could be that people don't even realize it's happened till it's too late. I think that would be the way that it would happen. So, yeah, I mean that's how I would do it. If I was going to do it, I'd want people to be in the dark until it was too late, and then I think you'd come back with some honey. So you'd say, that might be, oh, this terrible thing's happened, but here, we're going to fix it. Here's a QR code. Here's a CBDC. I mean, I don't know, Tom. It's all conjecture at this point, but I think we have to be aware of some of the things. I mean, the WEF did say in 2022, there's a 95% chance of a major global cyber attack. So take from that what you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of these signs are pointing in the wrong direction. And, kind of getting back to normal after COVID, I think, has made a lot of people complacent, unfortunately. We need to understand that securing our wealth is important. Building some type of resiliency in your food supply, or trying not to be preppers about this, but at the same time acknowledging the risks and trying to mitigate some of them. I don't think we're ever going to be worse off for doing.
No, I don't think it hurts at all. I've completely changed my life over the past decade in preparation for something like this. And, it's one of those things where the further you are away from it, the more radical it seems to other people. People are like, why would you do that? Why would you go back to farming or living like that? And it's like, I could see the headlights very far away, but they couldn't. Maybe I had the binoculars on. But, over the past few years, the amount of people that used to say those things to me that have said, oh, I wish I was living like you, Mike. Oh, I wish I'd have, it was a complete change of paradigm for them, because they've realized that the world's not right. And whether they know anything about this or not, I don't think any of them do. People are starting to feel insecure about some of these things, whether it's food supply chains, energy prices, even, Tom. Even if we're just talking about energy prices, my energy prices went nowhere the past 2 years. I pay, I think, about €8 for my energy, because it's such a low energy consumption lifestyle that I live. At night it's candles around here by choice. All of my heating comes from wood by choice, because I've got control over those systems. I don't have to worry about all of these things we're talking about as such. I worry about certain elements of it, and I worry about other people. But in terms of my life, if it all happened tomorrow, nothing changes. If the grid goes down tomorrow, nothing changes. I can just carry on living. And most of my neighbors will be okay as well. They've all got food. They've all got chickens, goats. I buy my milk from a neighbor. She's got cows. So nobody's going to starve. So I think just thinking a little bit more, put yourself in that situation of the Great Depression, read a book on the Great Depression about what it was like. And reading David's book, you actually get some insight into that. I think I would do that. And then just, I know we all love the modern world and we think it's going to go on forever, but I think we've also been seduced by a lot of that. We spoke before the show about how for many years our strategy has been to take advantage of the collapse of the everything bubble in terms of gold and silver miners. We've both prepared probably most of our adult life for it. I've prepared ever since I started investing. That has been my entire strategy. And all of that would go in this scenario. That's not going to work. So I think you have to have a one foot out the door as well. Just imagine that some of these things could come to pass. Get yourself prepared, and then I think you'll lead a lot more anxiety-free life. You can get on with living. I love every day, Tom. I live every day. I certainly don't sit around in fear about these things, but I think a big part of that is because I took the action. I got myself more prepared. And I think anyone can improve the situation as well. It doesn't have to be, running away to the middle of nowhere. You can just take steps at home, get a food store, get a water filter. These things are simple. We talk about this a lot on my channel. So I would just advise you do that. Yeah, I think it's prudent. And I think people who are smart, the author of the book, when I called him up and spoke to him, he was on his farm. He was canning. Just like in fact, I was canning on my kitchen table a load of harvested tomatoes, and he was canning a load of apples. So, these people, he's a smart guy. So that kind of reassured me that I was doing the right thing too. I'm on the right path here.
Mhm. Yeah, Mike, it's kind of funny. We were talking before the podcast about trying to come up with a way to end this on a positive note. And I shared with you the idea that I was out in the mountains camping over the past weekend. And even on the Friday, I was completely out of cell service and everything. And I was sitting by the fire the one evening and thought to myself, if the financial collapse happened today, the sun would still come up tomorrow, and I would still, get to enjoy this beautiful area that I had the granted the luxury of enjoying. But when we are when we understand these risks a little bit more and we're somewhat prepared for them, I think that is easier to be able to enjoy for sure.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it just always comes back down to risk management, and for me, that's what I've always tried to specialize in is preservation and risk management. But then once you've got that sorted out, you can speculate safely. And I think I mentioned before the show to you that I've only held 3 equities this year, and I held them for a total of 6 weeks.
Mhm.
And that's because I see the risk in the market so high. It's like I don't want to be in there for long. It doesn't mean you can't still try and profit from things. If you know how to risk manage, you can manage it. And maybe it's just a case of, okay, maybe we don't have so much exposure to those things, we have more exposure to real things.
Mhm.
And that's what I've been trying to focus on the past few years because of these risks. And that's all we can do is manage risks. But ultimately we have to live. And I don't want to spend every day panicked about these things or about money. And the most important things to me are my relationships with other people, particularly my wife, my family. I also have a lot of animals here on the farm, little animals that are vulnerable, and I have to take care of, stop the foxes killing my chickens. That helps me to think small and not just. These are big things that we're talking about and thinking about. But I think once you zoom back out and just try to live that day-to-day life, and tending a garden, looking after animals really helps. Having children, yeah, that they keep you occupied too if you've got them.
Mhm.
All of those things, I think that's what we should be focusing on right now, because ultimately we never made this system, Tom. We never designed it. We certainly don't deserve to go down with the ship on it. Some people are going to, and that's going to be tragic, but it's not going to help if we're not strong. It's not going to help if we haven't prepared ourselves. So I just to see this as a time to really reflect on life. I mean, I do that a lot on my podcast. It's nothing to do with finance, really. I do talk about some hidden histories to do with central banking and stuff, but I like to think about things from a more spiritual perspective too, and I think being out in nature for a lot of people is very healing, very calming. It certainly was for me my whole life. So yeah, don't lose perspective. Don't lose perspective. Go do what Tom did. Go camp in the woods. It's that gives you perspective on what's meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, everybody has their own definition of meaning and what gives their life value, but a lot of times it has to be a little bit more than just the amount of likes or tweets that you have, right?
Yeah, or digits on a screen.
Yep.
Digits on a screen or in a portfolio. I mean, those things are not going to define your life. Those things are going to come and go. But yeah, your family and once you feel more secure in your housing situation and all of that, you've got those kind of basic needs met. It takes some of the sting out of some of these. It took some of the sting out of the book, anyways. Put it that way. I didn't worry about it too much. I always felt like maybe this was kind of the end game that we was going into. This makes it a little bit worse, but yeah, I all like you said, Tom. I'm always hopeful. I think the more people that share these messages and read books like this, I think we could still steer this ship another way. I'm not fatalistic either that this is definitely going to happen. It's just one potential outcome. Does seem like it's likely, but maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe this podcast will help change things a little bit.
Well, Mike, I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. I couldn't have said it better myself. Hopefully we did David's book and message some justice here. Look forward to reading the comments and getting feedback from listeners, and maybe we'll have to do a part two, as you did, answering some questions and talking about a little bit more. Of course, everybody needs to go check out Mike's channel, Parallel Systems, on YouTube, and of course at Parallel Mike on Twitter, right? At Parallel_Mike.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube, Parallel Systems or Parallel Systems Broadcast, and you'll find my videos. I do have a Rockfin as well. So rockfin.com/parallel systems. I host my show, which is more about finance, and we're speaking a lot about this topic. and I'm doing a lot of research around this topic, trying to look for ways that we can legally protect ourselves too, in the form of there are all kinds of legal structures out there. So that's kind of taking up my focus there. But I do also have a podcast, which you can find at parallelmike.com or any podcast app. If you search for the Parallel Mike podcast, it's nothing to do with finance as such. It's deep dives into all kinds of things. I don't come from a financial background. Don't claim to be Tom. My background was theology and therapeutic work. So that's my background. So I talk about things completely unrelated to finance, and I think that's a good time. I do have a Patreon though as well, which is where we do have a community over there, which is people that are thinking about parallel structures, about how to get prepared, and I'll do a newsletter too, where I do give out value alerts when I'm taking those risks myself in the market. So yeah, you can find me pretty much anywhere, Tom. And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you again. I really appreciate it.
Of course, Mike, and I appreciate your time and helping get this word out, as I think it was important to be able to discuss this topic without the author at this point. So again, really thank you for your time and all the effort that you put in to help make this happen.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I look forward to speaking to you again another time.
Absolutely. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.